Hi, folks. This week we are extending our discussion of the Romantic movement in American literature with in a completely different way. So we last left off talking about the Transcendentalists, Walt Whitman and Ralph Waldo Emerson. And if you'll remember, this movement was a connected to the Transcendentalist philosophical movement, but it's also sort of a subset of the American Romantic movement. Now, we are still within the American Romantic movement, but we're sort of going the complete opposite route with Dark Romantics and American Gothic literature in this story set. So I'm going to separate both of these, and we'll talk about American Gothics um, in a different and another part. However, for this video, I want to talk about Dark Romanticism as a whole and Nathaniel Hawthorne, the first author. So, dark romantics are sometimes referred to as anti-transcendentalists. They are sort of their opposite in every way. Remember, transcendentalists inherently believe that people are good, that nature is a place of self-discovery and divinity, that the self is the source of all self-actualization and exploration and almost enlightenment, right? Well, dark romantics take that in a completely different direction. Dark romantics generally believe that humans are flawed, that they are very fallible, that they are prone to sin, and they are prone to self-destruction. They take this idea of romanticism and take it in the dark direction, just so to speak. Dark romantics also they do see nature as a sort of spiritual place, but whereas transcendentalists see it as a divine place, dark romantics see it as a place of mystery, of the supernatural, as a place of decay. Oftentimes, you see people within the dark romantic tradition going out into nature and facing sort of monsters in some iteration, and that's uh, in many ways a response to what the dark romantics were responding to. So, the Puritans, as we have discussed in previous videos very briefly, the Puritans were very influential during early American literature because they did value literacy so highly, but they were also highly religious, and their form of religion was in many ways very fundamentalist, um, very radical in a lot of ways. Puritans did believe that there was sort of, there were some Puritan sects that believed that the devil was in the forest, essentially. Dark Romantics sort of take this idea and play with it and make it a little bit more real in many cases. Um, Dark Romantics also are often anthropomorphizing evil. So rather than have evil as this sort of thing that's separate from others, oftentimes you see evil taking the shape of something or being symbolized by something. So in your first story, Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Birthmark, you have the birthmark, which is symbolic of so many different things, but well, essentially evil is one of them. And then in Edgar Allan Poe stories, The Raven and the Black Cat, you also have the anthropomorphization of evil in the title characters, the Raven and the Black Cat. Now, I'll get into that more when we get to talk about American Gothicism. Transcendentalists also were very sort of believed in the idea of improving society, improving humanity. Many of them were at the forefront of abolition movements. They were more inclusive of women than people had been in the past, which is not to say that that was a very hard thing to do. But at this point, I mean, they did include women in the transcendentalist movement to some extent. However, dark romantics, it's not that they were against this sort of progress, they just believed that we were constantly failing at this sort of progress. So a sort of simplistic way of putting this is that transcendentalists are the optimists of the romantic movement, and dark romantics are the pessimists of the romantic movement. Um, Common themes that you'll see in dark romanticism include this human fallibility, the human propensity for self-destruction, judgment, punishment, the idea of evil taking shape in various forms, and the psychological effects of things like guilt and sin are also very common. The idea of insanity and madness shows up in dark romanticism, but we'll get into more of that when we discuss American Gothic literature. For your first reading in this story set, you are reading Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Birthmark. So, for a little bit about Nathaniel Hawthorne, he is one of the sort of big two in the dark romantic movement, along with Edgar Allan Poe. He was probably the closest dark romantic to the transcendentalist movement. He actually lived on a transcendentalist compound in his early adulthood. But he takes these ideas of Romanticism and he really sort of turns them in a different direction, as is typical of Dark Romantics. And I think it's helpful to know about his ancestry. So Nathaniel Hawthorne was born in Salem, Massachusetts, and his family had a legacy in Salem. They were members of politics. They were sort of very important in the church. They were a very sort of established family in Salem. And you've probably heard of Salem because of the infamous witch trials that took place. Now, these took place several, few hundred years before Hawthorne was born. But Hawthorne's great great grandfather was a judge in the Salem witch trials. He was one of the people that sentenced these women to death. And his great great grandfather was also not very apologetic about it. Hawthorne took great issue with this. As a matter of fact, he changed the spelling of his name in order to separate himself from that sort of tradition that his family was associated with. And you see in much of Hawthorne's writing that he is actually exposing the what he sees as the flaws with this puritanical fundamentalist ideology. He's most famous for the Scarlet Letter, and that's exactly what he's doing in that. Now, in the Birthmark, he's not so much exploring these puritanical ideas, but he is exploring these ideas of human fallibility and the propensity for self-destruction. It's a very good primer for dark romantic literature. So, for some cultural context, this story deals with a scientist who is married to his wife, and he is struggling with a birthmark that she has on her face, without spoiling anything too much. Now, what the story deals with, of course, there are all of these elements of sort of the psychology of human flaw, but the cultural context is also helpful to keep in mind. So this story deals with an issue that is still relevant today, which is bioethics. And this is essentially the idea of playing God with science or medicine. What are the boundaries of what is acceptable for us to do and what is not acceptable for us to do? So you hear this conversation happen today in regards to things like cloning or stem cells or the elimination of certain undesirable traits. At what point does that become unethical? Where do the boundaries of what we can and can't do exist? Essentially, the idea of just because we can doesn't mean that we should. And that's sort of what Hawthorne's dealing with, of course, in the context of his own time period. How uh, what is the nature of this idea of playing God with science, and what how does that relate to human nature and the flaws of human nature is what he's looking at. So one guiding literary premise to have in your mind as you're reading this story is the concept of allegory. Now, an allegory is a form of symbolic literature that has two meanings. It has a literal and a symbolic one. And within an allegory or an allegorical framework, you have figures that stand in for secondary ideas. Okay, so the classic example is the tortoise and the hare. And the literal meaning of the tortoise and the hare, it's just a rabbit and a turtle in a race, right? But the allegorical meaning, the turtle stands in for this idea of slow and steady methodical work, whereas the rabbit stands in for this idea of hubris and also, sort of rushing through things. And there's a message behind those meanings that you are to get away from the story, right? That's the idea of an allegory. You have two different meanings. Another classic example from literature is C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia. You have this fantastical story about children and a magical wardrobe and this other world, but it is classically a biblical allegory. So Aslan the lion stands in for the figure of Christ, and it's fairly heavy-handed once you get into the allegorical framework there. Now, the premise of an allegory is that you don't have to understand the symbolic meaning to appreciate the story itself. So if you never knew that the Chronicles of Narnia is a biblical allegory, it's not really going to affect your enjoyment of it, but understanding that allegory gives you another way to interpret the story. Now, in the birthmark, we have an allegorical framework happening here. There is some sort of message or takeaway or symbolic layer at play in this story. However, the interpretation of that allegorical framework is up for debate. And it all really depends on how you interpret the birthmark in the story. And there's so many different interpretations of it. Some people see it as a mark of evil, a mark of sin, a mark of nature or God, a mark of femininity, a mark of sexuality, all sorts of different things, racial sort of undertones with it. There are all sorts of different ways to interpret that. And the way that you interpret that birthmark is going to dictate how you interpret the allegorical message of the story. And as with all literature, there are no right or wrong answers, but I am looking forward to hearing what you all think about that. So that's something to be thinking about as you're reading. After you read The Birthmark, your dark romantic story, we'll carry on with American Gothicism, which I will cover in a separate video. So stay tuned for that.